Welcome to the I Own It podcast with Ben Reinberg.
So our guest today is one of the nation's most powerful speakers and driven motivator who teaches the sales and prosperity mindset philosophies that catapulted him from desperation, poverty, and prison to a life of wealth and prosperity. He is a wildly successful entrepreneur, a sales expert, and a New York Times best-selling author. This is a man that owns it, and so and I've admired for a long period of time. His name is Weldon Long. Weldon, welcome to the show. Wow, let's get right into it.
Awesome, but I'm excited to be here, man. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. There is a drum set immediately behind me, if you could see it, and is that true that you love to play the drums?
I've got a set of DWs right here behind this camera here myself.
Well, next time you will have to come in the studio, and we would love to have you here and play drums for me.
That'd be a lot of fun, man.
It'd be great. So one of the things that I've always wanted to ask you, as I've done so much research and I've been following you for a long period of time, is when you were in prison, what was so fascinating to me is that you really were self-taught. You gained knowledge, you read books, you listened to cassette tapes. How did that work in prison? Like, what was the schedule? How much time did they give you? Was it like, well, then you get 2 hours a day and that's it? Like, walk me through, how did that work in prison that you were able to obtain all this knowledge and the schedule and the time frame they gave you to do this?
It's a great question. I don't think I've ever actually been asked that question. So excellent question. You know, it was different at different facilities. When this journey first started for me, which was in June of 1996, my father had died, and I was out in a federal detention center in Las Vegas, Nevada. And because it was a temporary facility, there really weren't many resources such as a library and that type of thing. So that particular facility where I was kind of the first year and a half or so of this journey, like my library was a cardboard box full of books that the cops would come in and throw the books into. And so I just started rifling through those books after my father passed away. And I picked up originally, the very first book was The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And of course, I didn't know who Stephen Covey was. I didn't know much of anything. I was a 9th grade high school dropout, 3-time loser. I had already been in prison about 6 years at that point and had 7 years left to go. And so it just really began with that. And then whenever I would have a chance, when I read 7 Habits, he talks about a lot of other books in there. I would, when I was talking to somebody and somebody would say, you know, you need anything? I'd say, yeah, send me this book or send me that book. So it was really just about having books sent into me. I didn't have any other resources at that time. Later, I left from there and went to a big federal prison complex in Florence, Colorado, F.E.A.R. Florence. And there they had a legit huge library and learning center. And I remember I went in there, this would have been probably 98. There was a copy of Tony Robbins' Personal Power Program and the old CD program. And it was a 30-day program. And you'd listen to about an hour or so of Tony talking, and then there would be an exercise to do that day. And so I was able, when I had a chance to go to the library each day, typically between if I was working in the kitchen or working, you know, in the cell house or whatever, but would have some yard time or some free time, I'd go to the library, I'd listen to that hour that day, I'd do the exercises. And we were very fortunate in that particular system. We were part of the interlibrary loan system. So I could go on this catalog and order books from any library in the state that was part of this program. So I had access eventually to tons and tons of reading materials. And that's really was the foundation of all of it.
So when you're in your cell, you know, you talk about how you took toothpaste and you put a piece of paper up there. What was on the piece of paper in your cell that you were looking at on a frequent basis?
Yeah. So as I began to study and read, I started getting the connection between our habitual thoughts and kind of our reality, kind of as Emerson summarized, and we become what we think about all day long. And I started reading some other stuff, and I came across a quote from Friedrich Nietzsche. And Nietzsche said, "We attract that which we fear." So I started realizing all the stuff I was afraid of, like going to prison, being a loser, being broke. I was attracting those things in my life. And I got the bright idea, I better start thinking about different things. So I wrote this list out of what a perfect life for me would look like. And the very first thing I wrote down is that I'm an awesome father to my son. At that point, I had a 3-year-old son. I had fathered him out on parole a few years earlier. And so I wanted to be an awesome father. I'm wealthy beyond my wildest dreams. I have a beautiful home in Colorado. I have a beautiful home on the beaches of Maui. I have a beautiful wife I can love and trust. And I just wrote out this almost a fantasy life. And as you mentioned, I put the toothpaste on the back four corners and I began to study and meditate. At that time, not understanding the neuroscience, in terms of, recreating and, these neural pathways and new habitual thought patterns. It was what the book said to do. Napoleon Hill talked about imagine yourself already in possession of these things and get emotionally connected. So I just started doing all that stuff, and lo and behold, it began to completely change my mindset.
So you bring up Steve Covey, who was one of your mentors.
Yeah.
When you first met him and after you read the book and you did a lot of research, what was that conversation like? Did you ask him for advice? What resonated with you when you met him to develop the bond that you had where he was a mentor? Explain to me how that came about.
Yeah, it was a crazy, crazy story. So June 10th of 1996, my dad died. And that was the day I went into this box, just desperate for some help and some understanding and some perspective. And June 10th of 96 was the day that I picked up a copy of The 7 Habits. Well, 7 years later, that was my roadmap initially, and read 100 other books. But 7 years later, I get out, I build my first successful company. And in 2008, I had written my first book, which was a book called The F.E.A.R, which was an autobiography. And I was talking to the publisher, and they were like, who would you like to have, endorse the book? We got to start working endorsements. I'm like, Stephen Covey, man. They're like, you're not getting a Stephen Covey book. We were thinking like your mom or maybe the mayor of your town if you know him or something like that. I said, well, you work on whatever you want to work on. I'm going to work on Stephen Covey. So I added it to what I call my prosperity plan. And I just wrote down Stephen Covey has endorsed The Upside of Fear, started visualizing it. 5 months later, I'm speaking at an event, and this guy stands up to make an announcement. And he says, my daughter, Julie, is most of you, is a small business group here in Colorado Springs. He said, most of you know my daughter, Julie, is Stephen Covey's personal assistant. They're going to be in town next month. So if anybody here would like to meet Dr. Covey, let me know. And just like that, I'm right next to a guy. They set the meeting up. I get to the event. Dr. Covey speaks. When he's done speaking, he goes to this receiving line. He's signing books and talking to people. And I'm talking to the gentleman that had set this meeting up and his daughter, Julie, who I met that night. And the plan was that I would meet Dr. Covey later on in the evening. And as I'm sitting there talking to this guy, Gordon Edgin, and his daughter, Julie, I feel a hand on my shoulder. And I turn around, and there's Dr. Stephen Covey. And I had all these questions I was going to ask about writing and speaking and the 7 habits and all this stuff. And when I saw him face to face, he had walked away from that receiving line and just walked up behind me like I was dumbstruck. And I couldn't really say anything. I was like, what, Dr. Covey? And he says to me, he says, I was about 45 at the time, something like that, and 47. He was in his 70s. And he says, son, I really loved your book. And I'm like, I loved your book too.
Wow.
Me and 40 men of the people. So we chatted for a bit, and he put his hand on my heart. He told me I had a divine destiny, and we talked about what that meant and sharing my story. And I never got around to asking the questions about publishing and speaking and all that stuff because I was just so caught up in the moment. But the interesting thing, that was a Sunday night. And the following Wednesday, he agreed to endorse The Upside of Fear and bypass the whole process of going to this committee that would take a year because we didn't have the time. And he sent me the email with the endorsement, and it was June 10th of 2009. I hadn't even thought about the date. It was 13 years to the day that I had picked up the 7 habits. And so from then on, we became friends. I got to do some speaking events, became very close friends with his son, Stephen M.R. Covey, who wrote The Speed of Trust. And in fact, he wrote the foreword to my most recent book, my 3rd book, and just an extremely generous and wonderful family, and was very fortunate to have made the acquaintance of Dr. Covey. And obviously he was hugely impactful on my life.
So obviously you're a sales expert and you understand mindset and how the mind and body connect with each other. So you get out of prison, and starting a business is challenging. I own a business for about 28 years, and I know the challenges that go on with business. How does one leave prison, go work for someone, and then just a light bulb comes out and says, I'm going to start my business. I'm going to take it from 0 to 20 million like that.
Yeah.
Tell our audience, how does that come about? Because to me, that is so inspirational when someone can do that, especially in the situation you're in.
Yeah. Well, I will tell you, as most entrepreneurs and business owners understand, I have a very high tolerance for risk. And I think that's part of being an entrepreneur, especially back in those days, 20 years ago when I got out, because I had very little to lose. So I'm in the halfway house. This is pre-release center, kind of a halfway house shelter type of thing for about 6 months. And while I'm there, I'm trying to find a job. I knocked on doors for 6 months. And after 6 months, I happened to walk in the door of a little heating and air conditioning company. I don't know the first thing about heating and air conditioning, but the guy gave me a job as a residential salesperson. I learned just enough to be able to sell these systems. I did that for a year. And of course, I had no bills. I've been in prison for the previous 7 years, 13 out of the previous 15, but straight the previous 7 years. So I was saving money. And after about a year, I'm like, man, this business looks pretty simple. If I could just find somebody who understands the mechanical operational side, I can do this myself. And so I found a guy and I hired him, and I took out a full page ad on our Sunday newspaper. I didn't have a building. I didn't have a truck. I didn't have a license. I didn't have anything. I took out a full page ad in our Sunday newspaper that said air conditioning and furnace blowout sale, operator standing by to book your call. And my cell number was across the bottom of the ad. And I was the operator standing by. And I set 16 sales leads that Sunday and started running them the next Monday morning. And eventually got with the building department and got the licensing we needed. It was it was hand to mouth for a couple of years. But eventually figured things out and grew a very successful company. Sold that in 2010. Spent the last 12 years or so speaking. I actually am back in the heating and air conditioning industry now. When COVID hit, I was like, well, what am I going to do with myself? I'm a professional speaker. There's not much speaking going on these days for 2 years. So I opened up another company with my brother-in-law, and this is our third full year. And we're budgeted for 10 million this year. So we're growing it very quickly as well.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
One of the things that I love about that you talk about is your son and your relationship with your son. I have 3 kids and I have 2 boys. And so it really touches me when you talk about it. Explain to everyone. So when you were in prison, I believe he was 3 years old. Correct me if I'm wrong on my stats. And when you get out, tell me about that moment. Explain the moment, the conversation you tell everyone about what he said to you and how he felt about you and what that meant to you. Out of everything you've done and I've seen, to me, that's what touches me the most is your relationship with your son. Tell everyone about that. I think it's pretty special.
Yeah, it really is the most important part of my entire story, to be honest with you, because he's the product of my choices and decisions, for better or for worse. Obviously, for a good portion of his life, they were really bad decisions. He was 3 years old when I went back to prison the last time, and he was 10 years old when I got out. And during those years, from the time he was 3 to 7, I built a relationship with my son through letters. He was with his mother, and she was homeless, and she had a drug addiction and a lot of different things. And so I wouldn't always know where he was, but I would write these letters, and I would send them to his great-grandmother. And she would read them to him when she saw him. And really, I stayed in touch with him through those letters. Every now and then he would respond, with some kind of card. He was a little kid, what do you expect? But I wanted him to know that one day I knew he would look back on these years. And I wanted him to know that I was always fighting to get back with him. I didn't want him ever to think like, well, you didn't care. You didn't even call me. You didn't write me. So I wrote my son hundreds of letters over those 7 years, like literally hundreds of letters, a couple a week typically. And it's interesting because when I got out, he was 10 years old. I got custody of him. I raised him. And when he was about 16, he went up to see his Nana, his great-grandmother. And when he came back home and he got out of the car, he had a shoebox with a ribbon, a bow tied around it. And I was out in the front yard working. I'm like, well, what do you got there, son? And he said, Dad, these are some of the letters he wrote when I was a kid. And they were some that had never made it to him. They were just, Nana had put them in a shoebox, lost track of them. And all these years later, she found them in her garage. And in fact, I hadn't planned on talking about this, but I'm going to share. This is just one passage from The Upside of Fear, my first book. And it really goes to that situation. So it says, last summer as I worked in our yard, Hunter walked toward me with a stack of letters. Look, Dad, he said, look at these letters he wrote when I was a kid. I stood there with my son, now nearly a man, in the front yard of our mountain home on that glorious summer day. And I read the letters with him. These are letters. He was 4 years old when I'd written them. I thought back to 12 years earlier when I had written them on a dark, lonely place. And in that moment with Hunter, I knew my life was fulfilled. The hard work, the determination, it all paid off. It was all worth it. Together, we read the words I had written so many years before. This was from a card that I wrote on his 4th birthday. I said, "Dear Hunter, you are truly an angel boy, and you embody all that is hope and joy, love, goodness, and pure. There's no man on this planet more proud of his son than I am of you. I realize, son, that I've made mistakes, and I'm so sorry that I'm separated from you, but one day I will be with you again, and never again will I do anything that will result in my being apart from you. I love you, and that will never change. Love, Daddy." With a smile, Hunter turned with the letters, and he walked away, knowing that his father had always loved him. And that was the payoff, man, because that was a thing when he grew up. He's 29 now, but I wanted him when he grew up to know that there was never a day that I didn't love him, even though I was gone all those years. And he's definitely, his life is the best part of this story.
Tell everyone what he said to you when you first saw him. And
well, I think the time you're referring to is when I dropped him off for college.
Yeah,
it was a very special moment. When he was 18, he finished high school, went off to Colorado, University of Colorado, and just a couple of miles from home. So I didn't want a big to do. I just wanted to drop him off at school, let him go out and start being a man. And when we got there and dropped him off, the lady said, "Well, there's a mandatory housing meeting at 3:00." And I said, "Okay, we'll be here." She goes, "No, you won't. It's no parents. Today he's a grown man today, And so we got him all ready for school. We set his dorm room up and took care of his classes and books and stuff. And that afternoon, I dropped him off in front of the dorm, and I was standing there in front of the dorm, and I was just so proud of him, because he'd been through so much struggle. I was in prison until he was 10. His mother eventually died from an overdose a few years later. And I mean, the kid just really went through a lot of stuff. And here he was at 18, and he finished high school, and he got into college. And I went over and gave him a big hug. And I just told him, I said, "Son," I said, "my greatest wish for you is that one day you will have a son that you love the way I love you, because it's the only way you're ever going to know, how it feels to be a dad." And I stood back and I put my hands on his shoulders and I said, "Son," I said, "words cannot describe how much I love you and how proud I am of the man that you've become." And my 18-year-old son kind of looks at me and reaches up. He takes my hands down and puts them down by my side. He puts his hands on my shoulders. And my 18-year-old boy looks me in the eye. He says, "No, Dad, I'm proud of the man you finally became." And that moment was just like, it was beyond sublime. It was just the mutual love, the mutual respect, the mutual recognition that we made it. And so that was a very, very special moment, one that I'll never forget.
One of the things that creates success is living a life of inspiration, not of desperation. And I think you've shown that time and time again with your actions. So all of us are a work in progress. I'm constantly working on myself to improve. Can you share an example of where you had it wrong and you didn't own it fully, where you could look back and say, I need to improve on this in my life?
Yeah, it was the first half of my life. I love the title of your podcast, Own It. And because one of the biggest things that people have to wrestle with if they really want to have success is just unmitigated personal responsibility. I live by a very simple acronym, CPA. I cause, permit, or allow everything in my life that happens to happen. And people sometimes have a hard time with that. It's so easy to blame these other institutions, situations, people, circumstances, whatever. And it's very easy because that's what we see, right? We don't see ourselves. We see the role this person played in it. And one day it hit me that because I was in prison. This was right before my dad died, and I was in prison. It was the third time I was in prison. And I was angry at the judge. And there was my ex-wife's, we were still married, but she had a boyfriend, and they were testifying against me, and the prosecutors and this and that and the other. And one day it occurred to me that, because I thought my problems were all their fault, right? And it occurred to me that if my life's going to get better, if it's their fault and my life's going to get better, that means simultaneously all these people are going to have to change 180 and get together, and they've all got to change at the same time, right? What's the likelihood of that happening, right?
Right.
But if I'm the problem and all I got to do is change me, well, then I got a pretty good shot at doing that. And I realized it was, if it is to be, it's up to me. And I started looking at every situation in my life, because there's always situations where there actually are other people that have some responsibility, right? Because people do things, people do stupid things. But what I realized is that in every situation that I was offended by, that I had some role to play in it first. And when I could go into every situation and I could see my responsibility in every relationship, every problem, that's when things started to get better. I'll give you the perfect example. My wife, I blamed her boyfriend, all that stuff. And then one day it occurred to me, like, maybe if I hadn't gone to prison and abandoned her, she had 3 other sons with all these boys with no way to take care of them, maybe she wouldn't have needed a boyfriend. When I could see my role and her actions, then all of a sudden it was like, okay, I can understand this. But people have such a hard time finding the role that they played in the bullshit in their lives, right? So I adopted that philosophy: cause, permit, or allow. Somehow, I don't care if I get run into a car, sitting at a red light, somebody runs into me. I'm like, okay, what role did I play in this? And people say, well, what if it isn't your fault? And here's my philosophy on that. I'm way better off risking the opportunity that I might take responsibility for something maybe it's not really my fault. I'm way better off doing that than risking not taking responsibility for something I should. So I just assume responsibility for all of it. If it's not really my fault, I can still improve the situation. I can make it better by accepting responsibility. Hey, what can I do to improve this situation? And it's just been a very, very productive and rewarding way to live. And I just don't look to anybody or institutions or people for blame. It's all me. It's how I think, how I perceive, how I act, what I say, what I do every day.
Yeah, and I respect that. And part of life is balancing, especially certain situation and experiences you've gone through. Can you now look back and say, okay, I saw the drawbacks of being in prison. Can you now balance yourself and say, I can see the balances and the benefits of being in prison and how that helped me become the man I am today?
100%. One of my favorite books is it's a book called Man's Search for Meaning, written by Viktor Frankl. And Frankl in that book talks about when you can find the purpose in your suffering, when you can find the meaning in the struggle, then you can do some great things. And I started to see the meaning of my struggle, the difficulties. Those years shaped me and they hardened me, and not in a hard way. I don't become a hard person, but they made me strong. And people ask me all the time, 13 years in prison, that must have been awesome. And I look back, like I wouldn't change any of it. I wouldn't change. I have 2 regrets in my life. One is my son and the fact that he was left alone from the time he was 3 to 10 and the things he experienced, which were some pretty rough things. And the other is that I couldn't be there when my dad died. I couldn't be there when he died. I couldn't go to the funeral, none of that stuff, because I was in prison. But other than those 2 things, I don't regret a single day that I was in the penitentiary, because that's what it took for me. And I found the purpose and the significance and the meaning and all that craziness. And that's where we have the opportunity for real growth and, frankly, helping others.
It's a great point. And one of the things that being in prison, I would have to imagine you're on a schedule and you're being disciplined. How did that convert when you got into business of, you got to wake up every day, you got to grind like all of us do? From the regimen in prison, how did that impact you going into business?
Yeah, it's funny because I've always said that I hate structure because I hated prison. But when I look back at it, like, I functioned pretty good in that environment. Like, the last 7 years, first 7 years, I was a knucklehead fighting and doing the crazy stuff. The last 7 years, as I learned, I studied and meditated and just educated myself. It's like I really benefit from this structure. And so I learned about myself that my initial thought was I hate structure, and it turned out I'm really good with structure, right? I'm really bad with no structure. Right. And so I tend to be pretty regimented in kind of how I do and how I approach things in life and in work and different things. And it all serves me well. I don't think you have to be that way to be successful. I think there's, different personalities and different strokes for different folks. But for me, I function well with the schedule and with a routine. And I don't know if it's just I got comfortable with that 13 years in the penitentiary, because, you don't control anything. They decide when you eat. They decide when you go to the yard. They decide when the lights come on. They decide when the lights go off. I mean, and that kind of structure, that might have been a little too much of a good thing. But overall, I found that structure serves me pretty well.
So do you have mental affirmations you tell yourself on a daily basis now that you've been through this journey coming out of prison and business, and you have impacted so many people with your sales training and your programs? What do you let the world know? What do you do on a daily basis? Do you have mental affirmations? You say?
Absolutely. So in my book, The Power of Consistency, I write a lot about this, about how we condition the subconscious mind and kind of grow new habitual thoughts. And over the 20 years, I spent people showing how to create what I call a prosperity plan. And it could be a personal mission statement, vision statement. It's kind of like the guidepost of who you are. And on that list, I outline everything that I want financially, everything I want with respect to relationships, everything I want with respect to health. Because in my mind, your money, which is your financial security, financial future, your relationships, which is marriage, family, community, and then your health, mental, spiritual, and physical health, that pretty much is everything really important in life. So I take each one of those three categories and I have one or two specific things I want to accomplish in each area. And beneath that, 1, 2, or 3 things I need to do every single day to help me reach that, right? Very simple. I call it the prosperity plan. And then I engage in what's called a morning quiet time ritual. And it's 10 to 15 minutes a day reviewing that list. I have just some scriptures and different things that are very impactful to me, some different quotes, and I read those, and it kind of gets me in a nice kind of mindset and frame of mind. And then I review, I'm an awesome husband to Taryn. Here's what I need to do. I'm an awesome father to Skylar and Hunter. Skylar's my stepdaughter. Here's what I got to do. I have business goals. Here's what I got to do. And every single day on one sheet of paper, I'm a big fan of simplicity, or I have focus and simplicity. Where your focus goes, your energy flows, and simplicity, simplicity, simplicity. So I have my entire life on one sheet of paper. Like, that's focus and simplicity defined, right? There's no complicated stuff. And on there, I have the things I need to do and the things that I need, the things I want, the things I need to do to get it. And it just gives me structure every day. I got to work on those things.
And does that go into the power of consistency? Is doing these things on a daily basis and structuring yourself?
Yeah, the power of consistency is built around the FEAR acronym: focus, emotional commitment, action, and responsibility. And the focus is getting clarity on what you want in your life. Emotional commitment is writing it down on a prosperity plan and reviewing it on a daily basis. Action, of course, is, taking consistent action towards those things. And responsibility is that your life is a reflection of your decisions, not your problems. You can have a bad problem and make good decisions and have good outcomes. You can have a good problem and make bad decisions and bad outcomes. The outcomes always reflect the decisions, not the initial situation. So those 4, that's what the power of consistency is about, that book. And it really just kind of goes into the essence of how do we have clarity, focus, and direction every single day? How do we consistently execute on the things we need to get the things we want in life? It's a pretty simple concept.
It's right on the money. I mean, it doesn't get better than that. When you're leading your trainings and you've impacted so many people in your trainings and people come through your threshold, what are the assumptions that people have that are blocking them or preventing them from having success? Like, what is that consistent thing that's going on with people where they're struggling? They come to you, they go through your training, and then they have these aha moments. What is that?
I think probably one of the biggest moments. So I use a metaphor of the box. And if I have a box here full of motorcycle parts and I pull those parts out and assemble them, it's going to be a motorcycle. It's not going to be something else. Well, the box is a metaphor for the brain, and the components of our life, they're in here. And what happens, neuroscientists estimate 30,000 times a day we make a subconscious decision, 30,000 times a day. Well, metaphorically for me, every time we make a decision, we're pulling out a little piece of our life out of that box. The question then becomes, what's in that box? What's in there, and where the hell did it come from? And a big part of that is limiting beliefs that we picked up. You come into the world, you don't really have any views about money, relationships. You're kind of an empty vessel, right? And the world starts putting ideas in your box. Next thing you know, you're 18 years old, you start pulling them back out. It's kind of like I tell people, have you ever heard your dad's voice or your mother's voice come out of your body? That's their junk coming out of your trunk, right? So we get these limiting beliefs about money, relationships, all these different things. They all go in there. When you're 7 or 8 years old and your father, mother, adult, any adult, grandparent, adult sibling, whatever, anytime an adult says something to you when you're a kid, it's taken as gospel. Kids at 7, 8, 10 years old, we don't have the ability to judge and discern the truth of something. When an adult says something, it goes in your box as truth, even if it's total BS. And what happens is I have another little process that when you have a thought, it sends a signal to a part of your brain called the hypothalamus. that secretes chemicals that trigger the emotional reaction, which drive the behaviors, which drive the results. And it's kind of this circle. And the crazy part about it is that our actions and our emotions are a chemical reaction of our thoughts, even if the thought is wrong. So we could have picked up an idea 30 years ago that's wrong, but it's still driving our emotions and behaviors and therefore results today. And when you think about it, if you're going to reach in that box 30,000 times a day, which is what neuroscientists estimate, then you better be sure you're reaching up and you're pulling out something you put in there this morning during your quiet time ritual, and you're not reaching out and pulling out something your dad put in there 40 years ago, because you might want something different. My dad put a lot of junk in my trunk about money and women. He didn't know anything about either one of them. I love my dad. I miss my dad every day, but he put a lot of limiting beliefs in my head about money and women. And so for years, I kept pulling out the same decisions because that's what I knew, right? My dad, for example, around money, my dad used to say rich people are crooks. Well, my dad said that's gospel. Rich people are crooks. If I saw a successful person or nice car, nice house, I go wonder who they screwed. Well, looking back at my life now, I'm almost 60, and looking back at my 20s, I can see why I didn't have the problem with stealing money to get money, because, hey, rich people are crooks, right, Dan? It became a self-fulfilling prophecy for me. So I think the real aha moments come when people realize that there are a lot of ideas that are in their head that are driving their emotional state and their behaviors. And it's all BS. It's somebody else's ideas, expectations, or desires. And that's when people realize, like, holy cow, I can love my father and I can miss my father, but I can also objectively say he had some really bad ideas about money and different things, and I can change that and still love him. In many cases, these limiting beliefs are like hands from the grave, because the people that put them in here are dead and gone, but they're still holding us back. Rich people are crooks. Don't do it. It's funny. I work a lot of sales groups, and I'll do a game of word association. I'll have 1,000 salespeople, and I'll give them a word, and the word is salesman. And I ask them to write down the first one or two words that comes to mind. And they're inevitably very derogatory, negative terms: snake oil, high pressure, sleazy, lazy. And I'll like, and you make your living through sales, right? It's like there's a complete conflict. We have to make sure what's in here is consistent with what we want out here. Otherwise, there's a constant conflict and we struggle. We just can't get away, can't get to where we want to go, because we're constantly battling what we want to do today versus my dad's voice in my head from 40 years ago.
And many people feel, Weldon, that you have to hit rock bottom to transform. Obviously you say you were below the barrel. I don't know how someone can be below the barrel, but I love when you say that, because it makes me think. So if someone comes to you and they're looking to transform and they hit rock bottom, what's the advice that you could share with people who have that sentiment? I mean, people probably come to you all the time and they're just, they might be at rock bottom, they might not. They're looking for a transformation. And how do you deal with that?
Yeah. Well, before I get into that, I will say, when I talk about being under the barrel, like if you take a big old wine barrel and you kick it over and there's all that mud and there's earthworms and all that in there, maybe some scorpions and centipedes, that was me down there. That's what I mean by under the barrel. I was looking up to see the gutter type of thing. This is hard for people. And I'm not an insensitive person. I believe that I'm an empathetic person, but I also believe Emerson's kind of belief that regret calamity only if you can thereby help the sufferer, right? I will not engage in just misery and complaining and suffering for suffering's sake. If we're not solving the problem, I simply can't engage, right? But if somebody's trying to help themselves, then I'm totally willing to engage. So my wife sometimes thinks that one year for Christmas, and we've been married 10 years, and 5 or 6, 7 years ago, she got me like 3 books on empathy for Christmas. And I'm like, it's not that she's a total empath. Don't get me wrong, hypersensitive. And I'm not, I feel like I'm empathetic too, but you got to be willing to help yourself. I'm not going to just talk about your problems for no reason. So when I have somebody that says, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? The first thing I tell them that's so hard is I say, you have to identify everything that you did to be in this situation. Not what the ex-wife did or your dad or their ex-boss. We all know what they did. We get it. You need to identify everything you did to contribute to this situation happening. And if they can go through and do that, then there's hope. But there are some people, they simply cannot do it. It ain't my fault. I mean, my ex-wife and my ex-husband and this and that and the other. Okay, we'll see you. Because
and isn't that really owning your own behavior? you're really owning your own behavior
Yeah.
and saying, okay, let me find out who I am and start loving myself. And then my actions will lead to better behavior.
Absolutely. And it all starts with personal responsibility. If we cannot see the role that we played in creating these negative situations, then it's going to be a tough battle.
So, like I said, you've been wildly successful. And someone that was in your position and now to become a wildly successful businessman, what motivates you today? You've went from so low to so high, and it's like, okay, how do you stay motivated?
Yeah. I think it's twofold. Number one, like I'm always throwing down new challenges, and I shouldn't say always. As I'm getting older, I'm taking it a little easier. I'll sit on my butt for 40 years. So I didn't even start it. I was 40 years old when I got out the last time. So I've worked really, really hard for a lot of years to make up for lost time. For me, it's always about putting another challenge out there, maybe a book or maybe a business or something, and giving something to work for. This heating and air conditioning company, which I never thought I'd be back in that industry again. I've been consulting and speaking in the industry for 20 years, but I never thought I would be back on the contracting side. But it's actually been really cool. This morning, I had two things on my calendar. I got this podcast and I got another podcast later. And like, what am I going to do today? Because I'm not retired, but I'm kind of semi-retired. And I went over to the heating and air conditioning company. I worked with my sales guys for a couple hours. So it gave me some purpose and stuff to do. That's one part of it, challenging ourselves and setting new goals. The other thing I think is really, really important, especially for people who've had a lot of success. And people do ask me, it's like, well, my marriage is great. I'm financially secure. My kids are great. My health is great. Like, what am I supposed to get motivated about? And it comes down to one word: contribution. What are you going to do with that success, right? If you go back to, high school, or maybe it was college, I don't know, different people study, but I read the books about psychology and Abraham Maslow and that hierarchy of needs, right? The basic food and shelter and water and oxygen and relationships. And as you go through, our needs get more and more complex. But the final kind of piece of the puzzle is self-actualization, is what he called it. And what that really is helping others. Dr. Covey wrote The Eighth Habit. It was the same principle. Like, okay, now you've had all this success. What are you going to do? So I think that people that have had a lot of success, and I do it, it's contribution. Like, what am I going to do? And the natural one for me, I've done a ton of it. Not so much in the last couple of years with COVID, but prison work. I do a ton of prison work. I go into prison 6 or 8, 10 times a year. And guys have developed programs on my books, and I go and I help them, and I participate in the trainings, and I go talk to them and encourage them and different things. So I think contribution is the key. If you've had a lot of success, you're wondering, like, what's supposed to motivate me? Get out of yourself and ask yourself what you can do for somebody else who's less fortunate. That, to me, is always a way to find something to motivate me.
So what are the hobbies? What do you love to do outside speaking, the HVAC world, your family? What if I'm in your house with you, what are we doing? Like, what are we like, are we going fishing? Where are you taking me? What are we doing?
Well, it's interesting because my wife and I just had this conversation a few days ago, because when I started, accumulating some wealth and some financial success, I had never done anything. So I was like, I got to do everything. and now that I'm almost 60, it's like, okay, what do I really, really want? And this conversation came around this very expensive exotic car that I have, and that I've had it for a year, probably a year or so. And I think I have 1,000 miles on it. Like, I never drive it. And it looks beautiful in my shop, and I just uncover it and wash it sometimes. But it's like, I'm not really that much into exotic cars anymore. I thought I was. And so I told my wife, I need to start. What do I really care about? Here's what I really, so number one, first and foremost, is my wife. She's my sidekick. She's my little buddy. And I got very fortunate at my stage in life to meet just an amazing, incredible woman. In terms of outside, I love to golf. I enjoy the sport of golf. And the last 3 years, the thing we've really gotten into is RVing and rock crawling with Jeeps. So we got this beautiful bus. It's like a Hilton on wheels. It's crazy. And I love getting my wife, and she's got her cats, and she got to have her cats with her. And we go someplace. We just were in Moab, Utah for a week. And I got this ridiculous rock crawling Jeep, and man, just getting out there with a bunch of people and watching people I don't do the crazy stuff because I don't have a death wish, but I do some fun stuff. But I'll watch the guys do the crazy stuff, and time in the RV, and then some golf. And, that's really kind of like my free time now. This bus is like, I if I could, my wife would never go for it. Like I would just live in it. Like we just travel around and live in it. I see people doing that. I'm like, it's so cool. I'm lucky if I can get about 10 days at a time. And she's like, it's time to go home, pal. So
is part of when you're running your business with the sales coaching and the expertise, are those moments when you're living in your highest value, where you're most passionate about? Because not only are you an expert, but you are serving others. You're passing, I always say that you have a responsibility to share your expertise with the world. And that to me is what you do. And you serve others. And I think it's fantastic. I think it's wonderful how far you've come, the value you offer to other people and how you serve them. Do you feel that that's your highest moment, when you're helping others kind of get out of their comfort zone, improve, develop, and really become the person they want to be?
Yeah, I mean, as much as I enjoy the RVing and the golf and the rock crawling and stuff, I'm not really self-actualizing in that moment. I'm just having fun, right? There's a place for that too, but it's not self-actualization. Self-actualization is that connection you're talking about, inspiring, giving someone hope and maybe a way out of a situation. And it doesn't have to be in prison. Prison is an obvious place for me to do some work because I have kind of the track record. They can't call BS on me. It's not like I was in prison for a weekend. I mean, I was there for 13 years, robbery,
Right.
Kidnapping, money laundering. I mean, just all kind of crazy stuff. And so I think the self-actualization, I think you're right. When you're engaging in that moment, and it's interesting because my business has changed a lot the last 4 or 5 years. I decided about 5 years ago that there were parts of my business I hated. Like I didn't like running my business. I had, salespeople and coaches and blah, blah, blah. And I got rid of all that about 5 or 6 years ago. And I started searching out relationships and ways that I could do the one thing that I love. And that is to create content, whether it's a book or a seminar or a keynote or whatever. Like I enjoy doing that. And so I started partnering with organizations that already have the audiences and distribution networks and sales teams. And I just distribute my content through them. And it's been really, really great. I hooked up with a nonprofit out in California about 5 years ago, and I produce all this content for them, some live events, some digital content, and they distribute it and sell it to their members. They've got 1,500 members in the heating and air conditioning industry, and I create programs, and I don't have to sell it. I don't have to plan an event. If they do an event, I show up and I speak. They've done all the planning, and they put the butts in the seats. And it's like I love it that way because I do the thing that I love the best, which is delivering content.
Fantastic. We're going to wrap up with 3 questions. Okay. And the first question I have for you is everything you've been through. If you had to go back and close your eyes and talk to your 16-year-old self, what would you tell the 16-year-old Weldon?
I would tell him 2 things. Number 1, you are responsible for everything you do. You're entitled to nothing. You are responsible. You got nothing coming. And I also would have told them that be careful what you think, because those thoughts eventually manifest themselves. And like if I had known that when I was younger, that there was a relationship between the negative thoughts and the outcomes, if I had known I was responsible and I was entitled to nothing, perhaps I would have done things a lot differently. On the other hand, my life probably wouldn't be what it is today, ironically.
That's priceless. I want to add, so it's your last day on earth, okay? So Weldon, it's your last day on earth. It's your last meal. What are you eating? Like, what are you saying? I have to have this. This is it. This is my moment. Anything you want. Drink, eat. What is it?
Well, if I ate this now, that day would come sooner rather than later. But I grew up in South Louisiana, so it probably would be some crawfish etouffee or maybe a seafood gumbo.
Wow. What are you washing that down with? What's the drink?
Probably washing it down actually with a soda, and then maybe a good rye whiskey for dessert, maybe a Whistle Pig or something, and a good cigar.
That's awesome. Yeah, where is the best place to get that in Louisiana?
Oh, the best food in South Louisiana, in my mind, and I'm sure there'll be some other opinions, but Drago's in Metairie. They actually have one in New Orleans at the Hyatt Regency downtown, but their original location's out in Fat City in Metairie, and just unbelievable. They have these broiled oysters. They broil them with all these sauces and butter and stuff. I mean, you can't eat them a lot because they'll kill you. But gumbo and Drago's oysters and some crawfish etouffee.
So you can see in the I Own It studio, we have electric guitars, a grand piano for you, and a drum set, and definitely want to have you back and jamming on this.
Are you a musician? Do you play that guitar? That
I
piano?
am not, but I am a huge fan, and it leads me to this question for you. So you're sitting in the studio with me, which will happen someday, by the way, and we will go to Louisiana and have a meal together. I could assure you of that. It would be a privilege. What musician or band would you have join us in the studio to play us a song? Who would that be?
Living or dead?
It could be anyone. Right. We could just bring them back from the dead if we had to.
Well, I would bring back from the dead John Bonham, who was a drummer for Led Zeppelin, who, in my opinion, was the second best. The first best drummer I'd also bring back would be Neil Peart from Rush.
Rush, yep.
And the best guitarist I would bring back would be Eddie Van Halen. Like if I could get with those three guys in a room and just talk some music and have some fun, it'd be amazing.
We would probably lock the door and not let them leave so we could be with them for a while.
They probably wish they were dead again. Like, this is too much work. Yeah, those are just the two best drummers on the planet, in my opinion. And the best, in my opinion, and a lot of people will say Jimmy Page and Yngwie and all these other crazy guitarists, but to me, man, it was Eddie Van Halen.
Thank you so much for your time today. What a treat. I want to let you know I have so much admiration and adoration for what you've gone through, what you've become, how you help people. And I want you to be able to share with everyone, how do they connect with you? Is it your website? What's the best way to follow you and connect with you? Because you have such a special talent that I think people are going to want to know who you are and how to get a hold of you.
I appreciate that. Probably the easiest way is through all the social media platforms. I probably use Facebook more than anything else. Just at Weldon Long on all that stuff. I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn. But my staff helps me with that stuff because I'm not on it. But Facebook, I'm on there fairly often. Go to my website, which is just weldonlong.com, WELDON, weldonlong.com, and can kind of stay in touch with some of the stuff that we're doing. And we're getting ready to launch this podcast. I've been thinking about doing it for a couple of years, and I'm like, what am I going to add to the conversation that's not already out there? And I listened to podcasts, and I've had some ideas. It's like, I'll be another sales guy with, just like, and finally it came to me that I want to do a podcast, and it's really going to be built around overcoming the adversity. And I want to interview people that have, yes, they may be successful, not in a business or financial way, but they're successful in some way. And they had to overcome enormous adversity. I did an event with a guy a couple of years ago. I met Aaron Ralston. He was the guy that had to cut off his arm in the Utah desert to survive. And just such a powerful story of survival. And he lives in Colorado, coincidentally. So we were coming back from Las Vegas in the same flight. We got a chance to really talk a lot. And like, I don't know if I could have done it. When he tells the story and how much pain was involved and having to break the bones and cut to the muscle and cut to the nerves with a rusty old knife, like, I wonder if I would have I can't do it. And just
there's probably not enough bourbon that you could drink that you'd want to do that.
But anyway, then people that do stuff like that, these heroic efforts to overcome struggle, man, is just the strength of the human spirit. It's pretty hard to beat.
Well, we want to wrap up, Weldon, and you got a busy schedule. Thank you so much for coming on. If you're interested in following the I Own It podcast, please click the button below. You'll be able to hear more interviews like Weldon Long and other guests that own it. If you want to learn more about the show and about Ben Reinberg, go to benreinberg.com. feel free to peruse the website. You can follow us on all social media platforms, and you can also go to alliancecgc.com to learn more about business. Feel free to follow us. Feel free to continue to listen to our podcast as we bring health, wealth, and relationships together. So thank you, Weldon, again, and we will talk to you soon.
Thanks, brother. Appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the I Own It podcast with Ben Reinberg. To hear our past episodes and connect with Ben, visit benreinberg.com.